Why are old-fashioned baseball socks so weird and loopy? Like, look at this thing. Why was this a thing? If you're a baseball fan, you've probably noticed that some players wear these weird socks called stirrups. No, not that kind, this kind. However, you might not be familiar with why they exist in the first place. Today we're going to be looking into the weird history of these odd-looking socks, from the slide that could have killed a Hall of Famer to how one of the most distinguished players in history changed the look forever. And finally, we'll look into the insurgence of long pants that almost killed the look for good. And as always, we might take a few detours on the way there. If you're a casual baseball fan, or if you've only followed baseball in the current century, you might not even know what I'm talking about when I say stirrups. After all, you're probably much more familiar with baseball pants looking like this. In modern baseball, you might find a few players who wear their socks high, but they are far from the majority. For instance, the Braves have several players who opt for the high sock look, and none of these players are actually wearing stirrups. These are plain baseball socks. These are stirrups. And just in case you're still not sure what the difference is, let me show you a side-by-side. It's this weird opening right here. That loop lets you know when a player is wearing stirrups. But why does it look like this? The truth is that players are actually wearing two socks on each foot when they're wearing stirrups. The first is usually a plain white tube sock. This is your run-of-the-mill plain white sock that looks like this. The second is actually a hose that has a stirrup-like arch that fits right underneath your foot. This is where the name comes from in the first place. So why was this sock an essential part of baseball uniforms for almost a century? It wasn't always, and it wasn't because of aesthetics. High socks have been a part of baseball since day one. Stirrups have not. If you look up pictures of players who played back in the 1800s, you won't find them wearing these things. Take a look at Cy Young, the actual Cy Young. Almost every bit of this uniform looks archaic. The short brim hat, the leather cleats, the collared jersey. All things players wouldn't be called dead in today. But these are just normal socks. They're hardly different from what star Ronald Acuna Jr. wears today. So how did these things begin to dominate baseball for nearly a century? It began with a hard slide that could have killed one of the best players in the game. On July 1st, 1905, Cleveland Nap star Nap Lajoie was spiked by Tiger shortstop Charlie O'Leary. In case you're wondering, yes, the Naps were actually named for Lajoie. I can't find another instance of a team being named for a current player. After the slide, Lajoie would go on to miss the next month and a half, and the reason was really bad. He suffered blood poisoning thanks to a wound that put him in a wheelchair, and it was thought to be because of the dye in the sock. Back then, colored socks weren't color fasted, which meant they were prone to fading and running, and the dye in the sock just happened to be poisonous too. The infection was so bad they almost had to amputate the future Hall of Famer's leg for fear the infection was spreading to the rest of the body. Thankfully, Lajoie's leg was spared, and when he came back, he had a solution to prevent poisoning from happening in the future. Instead of wearing socks that were prone to bleeding poisonous dye, he'd wear a clean white sock known as a sanitary in between the colored sock and his skin. Of course, if you've ever tried to wear two socks, you not only find it was uncomfortable but difficult to put on. Instead, a footless sock was devised with an arched bottom known as a stirrup. This new invention became mandatory for all players as a way to prevent future injuries like the one Lajoie suffered. However, if you were to look at pictures from players from the 1910s, you'd have to squint to see the loop. Here's a picture of Red Sox pitchers back when Babe Ruth was on the team. If you zoom in on their socks, you can hardly see the stirrup on Ernie Shore's foot. Ernie Shore, of course, was the person who pitched a no-hitter after Babe Ruth was ejected. This was how stirrups looked back in the early days, hardly visible. So how did this become this? The hatred of one of the most distinguished players ever. While the loop of the stirrup rose higher and higher in the 1900s, the stirrup was still the primary look. By the 1960s, this was the de facto look, and Frank Robinson hated it. If you're not familiar with Frank Robinson, you should go to his baseball reference page right now. This man has so many distinctions I don't know where to start. He's the only player to win an MVP in both leagues, one of the top 25 players in all of Major League history, and the first black manager in Major League history. His accolades go on for days. He was also a uniform revolutionary. See, the stirrup had an obvious flaw. They sagged. Frank Robinson hated this. He began to tape the stirrups to the sanitary socks, and even had a method of putting on his pants inside out to keep them from falling down. And then he began to do something else. Robinson wanted as much of the sanitary sock to show as possible. MLB did not like this new trend, and imposed a rule stating that no more than 6 inches of sanitary sock could be showing. Robinson didn't care. He kept riding the stirrups higher and higher, and the officials did nothing to stop him. If you wanted a good visual of just how much higher Robinson was wearing his stirrups compared to the average player, look at this clip from the 1971 World Series. Notice just how much lower the Pirates pitcher's stirrups go compared to the Orioles star. You're probably not wondering how Robinson got his stirrups higher anyway, but I'm gonna tell you. The simple solution seems like it would just be to get bigger stirrups, right? That's not what happened. Not for Robinson. That'd be too easy. Instead, he modified it himself. He cut the arch and sewed extra fabric to make the arch longer. And this trend caught on in the 70s. And by the 1980s, all you could see on most players was this pencil-thin strip of colored fabric. This look became so pervasive that some players began to opt for a new invention called the 2-in-1, which was just a plain white sock with 2 stripes printed on the side to imitate the look of a stirrup. This look was best exemplified by Hall of Famer Greg Maddux, who kept this look even until the end of his playing career with the Padres. This and looking like an accountant were just 2 of Maddux's signature looks. As less and less stirrup was displayed, pants began to grow longer and longer. George Hendrick was one of the first, with Uniwatch creator Paul Lucas pointing out that by the mid-80s, there was barely any socks showing at all. At the beginning of the 1990s, Scott Erickson became one of the first players to pull off the no stirrup look as well, although he was still apparently wearing stirrups. These 2 trends set into motion the looks we know today: solid color socks, no stirrups, or long pants. Pants, of course, got longer and longer by the 2000s, with players going through great lengths to keep them down, while the few players who did opt for showing socks brought them back up closer to the knee. It looked like the stirrup was dead. After all, it wasn't practical anymore. The thing it sought to protect against had long been solved decades ago. No one was gonna die if they got spiked like that again. And by the mid-2000s, wearing your socks high seemed uncool anyway. When Mets legend David Wright broke into the bigs and wore his socks high, on day games only might I add, his veteran teammates were relentless. Wright was known for being a bit of a uniform outlier. In addition to the socks, he also wore an orange undershirt while the rest of his team wore blue. But you might notice that Wright didn't even wear stirrups. Even players like Wright, who didn't completely give in to the long pant revolution, didn't bother wearing stirrups. So why am I still talking to you about something that's obsolete and has no influence on how baseball's played? Because somehow they're still not dead. Now they're seen as a fashion statement. We are living in the greatest age of baseball pant wearing diversity. Long pants, short pants, hunter pants, tight pants, loose pants, plain socks, fun socks, striped socks, dance socks. Stirrups are just one way players can show their personalities. Players like Francisco Lindor, Chris Paddock, and Noe Ramirez continue to opt for this approach. They do it because they want to, not because they have to. While some want this relic of the past to be mandatory again, I disagree. While they're a nice change of pace from the standard socks or long pants, I think it's just time to appreciate the diversity and uniform the game has to offer. Now, stirrups represent the game of baseball today. Have fun in the most you way possible.